All right, so Suzanne, would you like to start us out, please?
Okay. Well, first of all, since this is Women's History Month, I'm once again struck by how powerful the women are in this film. They're really the leaders. And I can listen to Eula McGill sing all day long. I just love her. Um, so I'm going to go back a little bit in time. I was studying anthropology with Margaret Mead at Columbia, and I was very, very into ethnographic filmmaking. And and this is 1968, 69, back in the day. And there was an ethnographic film festival at Temple University. And so I drove down with a group of friends, and there was George Stoney. And George Stoney just blew my mind because he brought his challenge for change. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, but he started something in Canada where he actually handed cameras to people living in communities so they could document their own lives, tell their own stories. And so he impressed me so. And I thought, oh, I want to do that kind of filmmaking. And then I lost track of George, went on with my education, and then I went to grad school at NYU, but I didn't study with him. He was in the undergrad school. But some years later, I was cutting a film about Darub bin Wahad called Passing It On, about a Black Panther. And George, and it was in a basement. I left my cutting room and went to work on that film for free, basically. And it was in a basement with dripping pipes and mice and all kinds of stuff. And George Stoney in the cubicle across the hall. And so we started a friendship. And he said, I've been working on this film for a long time, and I'm not sure I know I want it to be about the strike, about an unknown piece of history. I'm not sure how to approach it. I'm not sure if it should be my own life story because he's from the South. And but he said, but I've already shot about 400 hours. Would you have a look at it and tell me what you think? And, and at that point, I'd already been making films for a long time, directing and editing. And I said, sure, I'll squeeze it in. And so every night I would look at some more, and I was looking and looking and looking. And after a while, I said to George, I think you have the beginnings of an amazing film, but you're not getting the intimacy. You're not intimate with these people. You're putting them behind kitchen tables so that there's a distance between you and them. And I said, I hate to tell you this, but I think you have to go down and shoot some more. And he said, okay, I will. So he did. He shot for another year. And by then I was free to start working on the film. And it was extraordinary what I was hearing. I never understood about the shame that people felt and of their own history and how hidden it was. And so I just couldn't really find a way to tell the story because it was just a lot of talking heads and there wasn't a lot of visual material to work with until we came upon H. Lee Waters, who is responsible for 90% of the footage that you see, the old footage, because H. Lee Waters was from the South, and he was a filmmaker. And what he did was he traveled to all the mill towns and started documenting life there. And he was filming with a Bolex, which is a hand crank camera. So it's little short takes of things. And, not even a minute long very often, and seconds, some of them were seconds. But he filmed life in the mill town, and what he would do is he would put these films together and show them in the local movie theater and invite people to come and see their lives. And it was a way for him to make money and a way for people to come into the movie theaters and have the feature films make money too. So it was a very symbiotic relationship he had with feature films, actually. And so we started now Duke apparently has all of F. Lee Waters' films and all the raw material. We had to track it down, and some of it was in people's attics and basements and in libraries scattered all over the South, little bits and pieces. And I slowed all the footage down so that you could actually study it, and it allowed me to tell the story of these people's lives. You could see them in their daily lives. It was an amazing gift to the storytelling. So I've always been a proponent of telling the feel of history as much as the fact of history. And so this really allowed the film to give you the feeling of what life was like. I mean, I hope it did. I hope it conveyed that for you. So that's really the essence of the filmmaking. The music, I was able to collect a lot of sounds from the mills, from the National Archives. They had some great just audio recordings of the sounds of the different machinery. And I worked with a composer who I've worked with a lot, who's no longer with us, David Earl Johnson. And I gave him all of those sounds, and he started weaving them into a soundtrack, especially the opening. The opening is made up of the ticking of the looms and anyway. And then we brought in Alicia Spiegels, who was head of the Klezmatics, which was a klezmer band, and she brought her musicians in, and they recreated a lot of the music, based on the songs that the women sang for us, and we just twisted them and wove them throughout the film. I think that's my story.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. And I'm sure there will be questions and conversation. Let's turn to Mary Wingerd. Mary?
Okay. Well, you may wonder if you looked at my article, why I ever decided to do an extended research project about this obscure little former mill village in pretty much the middle of nowhere. In Coolabee, North Carolina, which is to this day kind of in the middle of nowhere. But, as so often happens with research projects, at least with my research projects, I kind of fall into them by accident. And the way my attention got focused on Coolabee was I had only recently come to know about the 1934 textile strike, which is amazing to me because it's one of the biggest labor uprisings of the time, and yet very few people were even aware of it. Certainly the children of the people who participated in it. It was the great silence created by the trauma that was wrought by that strike. So that was something that just struck me so profoundly. And it just happened then that a friend gave me this little newsletter from the Coolabee Historical Society that was sort of memorializing and celebrating textile life. And so I thought, this is kind of interesting. And when I looked into Coolabee, I discovered that this is a town that did not go out in 1934. And for anyone who doesn't know the after effect of the 1934 textile strike, it pretty much destroyed unionism in the South because it was so traumatic. And so from that time forward, the common knowledge was Southern workers were just not organizable. They, why you couldn't waste your time. The only other major organizing effort was Operation Dixie, which was pretty much a gigantic failure. And yet, Coolabee, in the little town of Coolabee, in 1937, only 3 years after this tragic episode in Southern labor history, the mill workers in Coolabee organized. They organized a union. They organized a successful union that operated until the mill closed in 1969. Oh, who could resist that for a project? So So I went to Coolamy, knowing nothing. And I managed to find somebody who would be my initial contact. And I interviewed many of these former mill workers who still lived there. That was the other thing about it that was so remarkable, because since the mill had closed in 1969, there was no economic basis for this community to exist. And yet people stayed. They stayed, and they had this little historical society as well. So I thought, well, I have someplace that's really exceptional here. And the answer to that was yes and no. It wasn't so much that it was exceptional, but that the timing of events played out differently in Coolamy than it did in other places in the South. And it really, doing a kind of a deep dive into the history of this town gave me some what I thought were really important insights into the labor movement as a whole, into ideas about class, that sort of expanded my understanding, which is kind of remarkable that you could go to such a little tiny place and learn so much. And, you know, of course, underlying all this is the truth that basically all history, Peter, I'm sure you agree with this, all history and all politics operates on two levels. On the one level, it's fundamentally local and experiential. People experience their lives in a very local sense. On the other level, the experiences that they're going through are being affected by big structural forces that constrain them and kind of shape the way their lives turn out. And that's what I saw happening in Coolamy. I won't go into the whole story of the article, but you know, the whole story of what happened over the course of time. But a couple things that were important to me that I'll just throw out there and we can talk about. First of all, let me mention that the Coolamy Mill was one of three owned by this big company, one of the big four in Southern textiles, Irwin Mills. And they had a mill on the outskirts of Durham, which is an urban center. They had a mill in Irwin, North Carolina, which I don't know very much about because I never researched there. And then they had Coolamy, which was this completely isolated place in the central Piedmont. And Durham and Irwin went out in 1934, and Coolamy didn't. And so what made Coolamy different? Well, first of all, what I really needed to look at was why did these people not conform to the pattern that Jacqueline Hall and her co-authors really set up in their seminal book, Like a Family, which is the first really important book that came out in the new social history about Southern textile workers. And their hypothesis, their argument was that that the whole South was kind of one big textile village, and that people belonged to this larger community. The community wasn't confined to a single place, that it was bigger, and that they were all like a family. Well, that's not what I found at all in Coolamy. I mean, the people in Coolamy didn't even think they were connected to the people in Durham or Irwin. In Coolamy, their identity, their class identity, their cultural identity, their complete sense of who they were was inextricably linked to the place. It was inextricably linked to Coolamy itself. And when I talked to them, this came out so clearly that, you know, mill workers had been denigrated across the board, lint heads, and called all sorts of names and looked down upon, and everybody was kind of aware of that. But in Coolamy, They had a very strong sense of themselves, but they didn't contradict the labels that were placed on mill workers in general. They said, but we're a better class of mill worker because we're mill workers from Coolamy. And so fundamentally, that kind of shaped who they were. And as time went on, it affected how they related to the labor movement, to organizing. And even though they eventually became sort of the model union, the most successful textile union in the South, they still did not really see themselves as part of something that was bigger than Coolamy. They were really focused on the local. I'm not sure what I make out of that, except that I think that it highlights the difficulties of creating a national organization or anything beyond. The farther you get from face-to-face relationships, the more difficult it is to sustain any kind of sense of mutual accountability, community, I guess. So that was one of the things that I thought was important. Another thing, since we're talking about Women's History Month, is when I looked at the first generation of people coming to the mills, and they were coming from the farms, and they came because they didn't really have any other choices. However, there was a great difference between the way the women and the men saw this change of lifestyle. These young women who came, they thought they were in heaven. The ones that I interviewed, they said, we got out of that hot sun, and one little old lady said, I'd been to Coolamy. I thought I'd been to New York City. And so for these young women, they saw this change in their lifestyle as not necessarily a bad thing. It was much more difficult for families and for men who had a lot of difficulty giving up that sense of independence. And I go into that in a lot more depth in the article. And so if you're interested, you can certainly look at it further. A couple of the other things that I think are useful for us in thinking about the labor movement in bigger terms is what fueled their grievances. When they went out, and they would go out, they would go to have these spontaneous walkouts when they were unhappy with the way things were going. And their grievances were never about wages. They were always about respect and working conditions. And what are the things that employers are most reluctant to give up is any control over working conditions. And one of the things that people brought up to me over and over when the stretch out finally came to Coolamy was their frustration that they weren't able to produce the kind of product that they were proud to produce. And that to me said so much of their discontent and their protest had to do with their pride in their work and their self-esteem and their dignity. And that just struck me really strongly. What else? Gosh. It would be difficult to go into in very briefly into the kind of union they constructed. I describe it as really community unionism. It didn't completely discard the kind of face-to-face negotiations that they had fashioned under the kind of more paternalistic setup previously. Because they still believed in the power of personal interaction and mutual accountability. And they were very successful until they weren't successful. And of course, that is the crux of welfare capitalism, right? It's great as long as it's great. And then, because because there are no real protections in the end. And in the end, even though their union was very successful in handling personal issues, they were never able to stop the stretch out. They were never able to really control the pace of production. And the mill closed in 1969 without a word of warning. So I'm not sure what my conclusion is here, but I think it shows, it shows, you know, it shows what a struggle it is. And I give those people so much credit for all they managed to do under such incredible power imbalance. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks, Mary. I'm going to take advantage of my authority to just, I want to ask a question to Suzanne, and fortunately, we also have some other filmmakers in the mix tonight. Mike Hazard, Howard Kling. I was so struck in watching, it had been probably 15 years since I had watched this film. I was so struck by how many of the interviewees launched into song as part of their conversation with George Stoney or Judith Helfand or whomever was interviewing them. And it reminds me of one of my other favorite labor history films, The Wobblies, where it seems like every interview subject sang at some point in their interview. And I know, Suzanne, you did not do the interviewing.
No.
But people launched into song without being asked by the interviewer, would you sing a little something for us? And instead it just came out. And I wondered, Suzanne or Mike or Howard, if there's anything that you might say about singing and the labor movement and what culturally this shows us. Suzanne, is there anything you'd want to say?
Well, yes, because I've been working for the last 8 years. I've been working on a film about 3 young women activists, and they're American. And the film originally started with the notion of centering it in America and on American activism, especially women's activism. And what I was finding with these women is that they sing.
Mm.
And that there's, I think that music and the lyric, it's it's like, it's poetry, and it's spoken word, it's singing word. It's a way of expressing yourself that's it's a shortcut, and it comes from the heart. And so I was surprised at how much singing these women do. And these women then joined forces with women in Egypt and Palestine and Mexico and Kenya, and the singing continued. And then they sing. I have so much footage of these women running down streets at night, bursting into song. So I think that is a heartfelt way of expressing yourself. I can't speak to all of labor history because I haven't really, unlike you, it's not my major focus, although a great interest of mine. But I think it is a very natural way of expressing yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and a comfortable way.
Mm-hmm.
When you see how they sing in the Uprising, they're singing back to the boss man, hey boss man, I'm not afraid of you, you're just tall, that's all. So it's an act of defiance, and it's empowering. I think singing is empowering.
Yeah. Thank you. Mike and Howard, is there anything you would add from your experiences interviewing workers and women in particular? You guys are going to pass? Howard?
No, I can, unfortunately, I had something, I think, but not after the last phrase you said. I don't remember anybody breaking into song while I interviewed them, unfortunately. So I don't have that. I might be wrong, but I was just, I mean, it's also, singing is, especially the songs people sang are things they usually did together. So it reminds them of the solidarity they feel, and it's an emotion when you do that. I was thinking what Mary was saying about dignity. I mean, singing is bread and roses. It's the roses part, right? I mean, it's about people's souls. It's about trying to break the alienation they feel, I think. And I mean, and it's pretty remarkable in the film. I agree. It's sure, and it seems like it's, and that's, in a way, I agree. That's the most important thing for people. They want to feel, respected, dignity. They want, be fully human, and they can sing.
Yeah.
Darn.
Suzanne, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is when you think about in the uprising, when they chose to sing "We Shall Not Be Moved,"
Yes.
when they're marching, and all of a sudden that's one of them starts singing, and then they all sing, and the Marseillaise provides that kind of empowerment as well. And then you think of chain gang songs and how that helped people on the chain gang not only feel connected to each other, but feel connected to some humanity and rise above the horror of their situation. So.
Mike Hazard, I see you've
Were there
unmuted. Please.
Well, were there no prompts, Suzanne, that you left on the editing room floor to elicit any, encourage song and singing?
Yes, there were prompts.
Yeah, because the music and the voices are what really bring the poetry to this piece. And it's just those little solo refrains. The moment you mentioned about I shall not be moved is a moving moment in the film, but it's all of those individuals singing from the heart that really makes the thing resonate for me.
Yeah.
Those little tiny moments of song, because they bring us into that thing that Howard's talking about, that singing together, that sense of solidarity. Yeah.
Well, Ross, what were you gonna? You would type something in the chat, please.
No, I was just saying that as you're talking, it seems to me that it's not an uncommon thing, that music is a form of resistance, and it has always been a form of resistance. And when we think about especially the resistance for African Americans in terms of the struggle for freedom, music has always been at the center of that and continues to be. So it does not surprise me, nor does it it doesn't surprise me that folks would be willing to break out into song. I guess what I'm wondering is to what extent does the Southern culture, how do I say this? To what extent does the Southern culture actually informs and actually animates, if you will, that resistance from the strike, as well as the music that was sort of imbued in how folks express themselves. When I think about Southern culture, and I think about, again, African-American culture, African-American Southern culture, that this has been a part of the history and, if you will, part of the DNA of the land. And so I'm just wondering how the filmmaker, as well as the writer of the piece, how they calibrated or this idea of the Southern culture, and to what extent did it make a difference in terms of how people saw themselves and saw their sense of resistance to authority.
Suzanne or Mary, you want to? Suzanne, please.
Well, I think, first of all, I think it helped tremendously to have George be the one who was asking the questions for the most part, because he's Southern. He was close to the age of the people. So he understood the culture. He could speak the language. He understood the signals, and so that helped tremendously. So whether that's strictly a Southern thing or not, I can't really speak to that. The Southern culture is different. You know, we all have the Northern, you can tell when somebody's from Connecticut as opposed to New York City, you know, there are different signposts for that. But in terms of music and revolution and empowerment, there's a long history of that, and a very long history. And so that was a natural thing to be tapped into. I don't think George specifically sought that out. I think the singing came first, and you know, with Eula just sang. You know, she just burst into song, and so that gave birth to the idea of let's explore some more singing. You know, what songs did you sing to comfort yourself? What songs did you sing to rouse yourself? And so that's I think became a theme that we looked for, and was very helpful, very helpful to me.
One thing I wanted to add, I was the sound person for a film made here in Minneapolis, Labor's Turning Point, which is the same year about the Teamster strike in 1934. And there was no singing on that set. And I whether it's because George wasn't there, or there were no prompts, or it's the Northern culture that Earl is kind of, I mean, I feel that Earl's really onto an angle there, because, you know, we, now I've been here since 1969, so it's we Midwesterners up in, we don't necessarily sing like that. And maybe there is something in the culture that led to a different kind of movie about each locale.
John Hanson, didn't you
Yeah.
tell a story at one of these events about your dad?
Okay. Well, there's a number of events. My dad rode the rails in the 20s and early 30s, and he came to Minneapolis to work in the coal yards during the winter. In particular, he rode the rails to work on farms, and he was a wobbly because of riding the rails. And an interesting thing that comes to me is that my dad played the harmonica, and he had a good singing voice. My mother did not have a good singing voice, and so when us kids would ride in the car to go any distance, my dad would have us sing songs. And what I came to realize over time, and I didn't realize it then, is a lot of the wobbly songs that he sang were actually a lot of common tunes that people knew from the day, and they just put words, labor words, and solidarity into the songs. And I think of the Internationale and the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and you see that going on. And my dad was very active in the 1934 truck strike in Minneapolis. He was a member of the Committee of 100, and singing was important to him. It was because of the Wobblies in particular. I think that was brought into his life, and he taught us kids these songs. And I'm surprised because I didn't think about that until recently when one of these labor history events. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, John, very much so. Ben Sorensen, you politely raised your hand. You want to show yourself and...
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I forgot I turned that on whenever I had kids bouncing around behind me.
Yeah.
Once I figure out how to turn back on this video, sorry about that. I didn't want you guys to see the kids jumping around. It's kind of interesting with the Wobblies, which labor is, of course, something that I'm highly interested in. With the Wobblies, they have always called themselves the Singing Union. And they often will say things like, sing and fight, right was the tyrant king who said, beware the movement that sings. And it's shown up on Folkways records and everything. But I thought it was very interesting that the wobbly songs, and I believe it was John Hanson who had recognized that these were old church hymns and other folk tunes that had gotten new words. Well, it's been passed down through the Wobblies up to Utah Phillips, who unfortunately died, about a decade ago. Mm-hmm. And he used to point out that the Wobbly songs were a bunch of old church hymns because they're pretty, and then they rewrote the words to make them make sense. So I thought I'd just share that in a little bit of lore with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
May I add something? My dad always talked about the Wobbly songs, and he talked about, especially when he rode the rails and they'd go to towns that were anti-union, they would sing these church hymn songs because they could get the labor word out without getting the attention of the police, because there would be that gospel mission or whatever in town where they had a band that would play the same music, but they just put labor words to it. And I thought that was fascinating.
Right. Right. Great. I want to make a little historical point to go back to Earl and the question of the place of song in African-American culture and resistance. People who have closely read what are called the Wpa Slave Narratives. So these were interviews that were done in the late 1930s with people who had been enslaved. There are over 2,000 of these interviews at the Library of Congress. There are a number of stories told of conflicts over who would be the song leader in the field. And that while enslaved people did not have the latitude to go on strike, that one of the issues that they did contest overseers about was who was going to be the song leader, because the overseers tried to select song leaders who would set a fast pace in the field, while the enslaved people were trying to get someone to set a pace that both the elderly and children could keep up with, because there was the danger of being punished if you were unable to keep up with the pace. So song as contested terrain, deeply rooted in African-American culture in the South. But then I want to open up the question of race. Oh, Mary Wingerd, please.
I just want to say, a couple words about singing and in the context of the textile strike of 1934. I don't want us to get too carried away with how inspiring the singing was, because there were a lot more people who were not singing after 1934. That was a devastating loss in the South. And most people, I think that the film did an amazing job of finding people to talk about, because there's a reason why no one knew about it. No one talked about it because it was such a traumatic experience. And in fact, I'm reminded of some work that was done by my friend and colleague George Waldrop when we were both working on this is about 20 years ago, and he found a woman by the name of Annie West, lived in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and she had been incredibly committed and devoted to the cause, and worked even with Francis Gorman, and really believed that it was going to change everything. Well, of course, she's one of the people who was blacklisted, lost her job, lived the rest of her life in the site of the mill. And when my friend George tracked down her son, Annie had passed by that time. And she had been like this amazingly committed person for years. He never knew that she'd ever been involved at all. He never knew she'd ever worked in the mill. So I think we have to remember that too. That, I mean, I do think it's great to talk about, how important the songs are and stuff, but I don't want to lose the reality that this particular strike was a devastating moment. The difference between this and Minneapolis is less, South versus North, and more that Minneapolis was a big success, and there is a lot to celebrate about the Teamster strike in Minneapolis, whereas this was a disaster. And the union, the national union, did not have the resources to support these people, and they felt completely abandoned. So I just had to throw my little bucket of cold water out.
Oh, thank you. No. And Dania, you want to say something about how McCarthyism had a similar impact on what people would remember, or how they would remember and share stories?
Yeah, I mean, as you were concluding your remarks, Mary, I was just thinking about how similar that is in the kind of social history of those who survived McCarthyism, and the difference in families, right, between those who carry the stories and those who didn't, and the way that families do or don't relate to people who name names, but that sort of like deep and intense silence that kind of pervades the kind of catastrophic loss. And so I was just kind of thinking about how that reverberates in different cultures.
Yeah, thank you. Suzanne?
I just, what fascinated me was that, yes, this was a horribly traumatic experience, and they felt so much shame that they didn't pass any of this on to future generations. But so many of them saved documents. They saved letters they wrote. They saved the correspondence. They saved, when they did finally join the union, their union cards. They stored the history. They stored the photographs, even though they weren't sharing them. But it meant so much to them that they wanted to save it. Even though they were outwardly eradicating the history, they were still saving it as well. And I found that so interesting.
Thank you. Chamath, what are you thinking about?
I was thinking about a great many things. I too was struck by the mentioning of shame, and I think Suzanne brought it out beautifully. And Mary also complimented it by saying about how the pride that the workers in, I forget the name of that small town, that they felt in their work and in their place. And my question is kind of for Mary, what were the conditions, or what were the reasons why they had such a strong local identity? And did you do any comparative work to find out the difference between other similarly small and isolated mill towns? And a small rider to that, I really like your concept of community unionism. It makes a great deal of intuitive sense to me. I'm not a labor historian at all. But at least two scholars I've read, Katznelson and talking about the industrialized world in general, and James Petrus talking about South America, specifically Argentina, have said that there were strong union movements and solidarity because the workers lived in communities. They were neighbors as well. So I just want to add that, and if you would care to expand on both of those, especially the community unionism concept.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Because their loyalty to the union, there were so many threads that tied them to each other. Family, they were related by family, they were neighbors, they had this history together, they worked together, because they were so isolated and had created this kind of defensive identity against people who looked down upon them. Now, interestingly, their greatest rivals were the only other town in the county, Mocksville, which was, a pretty little dot on the map itself. But the people in Mocksville looked down on the people in Coolumee because they were lint heads, they were textile workers, and even other textile workers. One of the people I interviewed mentioned that when the flying squadron came to Coolumee to try to get the people to go out, she said, that girl, I wasn't going to listen to her because she was from Salisbury, which was a town nearby, and they have a mill, and they were never nice to people from Coolumee in Salisbury. So they saw, it's in a way, this sense of place. There's a hierarchy in what mill you belong to as well. So they understood people within this hierarchy. For example, if you worked for the Fulton Bag Mill in Atlanta, you were like the lowest of the low. And so I guess it would be like if you went to Harvard versus, I don't know, the university that I taught, St. Cloud State. This idea of kind of this hierarchy of who you were. So, and about community unionism, in Coolumee, they had worked out a system, a sort of a negotiation with Gerald Zahavi, who is such a smart scholar, what he called a negotiated loyalty. He described paternalism as negotiated loyalty, where you had this cross-class loyalty as long as everybody lived up to what was expected to them. And so you were all like a family as long as everybody did their part, and them in management as well. And so management was always having to negotiate with the workers. And as long as having a stable, settled workforce was important to them, that system worked because they would respect the workers' rights. And even when it started to break down, the workers, even though they organized a union, they didn't want to completely throw out all the kind of modes of negotiation that had served them in the past. So the union became a tool to kind of sustain and uphold those old ways of interacting when that face-to-face paternalism wasn't working anymore. And part of the reason it worked is because this is always so complicated, that Irwin Mills didn't really oppose them organizing, because they were trying to get some kind of order, some regulation in the mills, rather, because when they only operated on a face-to-face basis, people were walking out every time something displeased them. The spinning room might walk out for a day. And in the late 30s, when the profits were just beginning to return, they were at this really fragile profit line, and they're dealing with cutthroat competition from other mills. It was really important to them at that time not to have any work stoppages. And so they thought if they allowed a union in, then that would help regulate negotiations between the workers and management. So it's a very complicated, multifaceted set of circumstances that bring this all together. But the community unionism actually functioned well on individual grievances. They were very effective in resolving individual grievances, but not in the larger structural problems. I don't know if that answers your question or not. I'm kind of rattling on here.
Oh. Judith Eisner, is that your hand? Yes.
Okay, I have a question for you, Mary, because I was really struck by the strength. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I was struck by the strength of the hierarchy, which I think came from not only this, what you're calling paternalistic structure, came from the church, it came from the KKK, it came from all over. But specifically going back to the fact that this is Women's History Month, I have a couple questions. So first of all, were women getting a smaller paycheck than men in the mills? Secondly, were they being provided anything like maternity leave or anything that women in particular would need that men wouldn't? And I was also really struck and disturbed by the fact that women's unpaid work, which is to cook, do laundry, take care of the children, was being done by Black women. And I was wondering why, how did they afford to pay these Black women some money that they were barely able to feed themselves with? And so were we just passing on this unpaid women's work onto Black women? It was very disturbing to me. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little.
It is disturbing. It is disturbing. And in fact, when you know how little textile employees made, the fact that they were able to hire African-American women to do their housework tells you what they were paying them, how little they were paying them. In terms of, I wasn't able to get numbers on the salary. This was, I mean, it's 25 years ago that I did this research, so I don't remember all of it really clearly. I'm quite sure women did make less than men because the men had the higher level jobs as loom fixers, the ones that were considered to be higher skilled. Women were the spinners, and I don't remember what their other jobs were. But the thing is about why wages were not very important in the community were because their way of life was a sort of 1 foot in rural life and 1 foot in wage work. So they didn't make very much money, but the company had bought up 5,000 acres around this village that they constructed, and they allowed the workers to have free use of this. They had huge gardens, they had chickens, they had cows, they could hunt, they could fish. And so in a way that kind of eased that transition for them. So they didn't feel, well, the way they described it is everybody was poor, but we didn't know we were poor. So the fact that they had fairly low wages wasn't such a hardship for them. At least that's the way they describe it. Now, let me say, this place was probably the best case of a paternalistic mill village, which is why it worked. And there were all kinds of reasons. Actually, it was the Duke brothers, Benjamin and James Duke, who were the main owners of Irwin Mills, and they were busy creating Duke Power, which became the largest power utility in the South. And their bigger concern was to bring in industry, bring to the South, so they would have customers for these giant power plants that they were building. So one of the things that they like to showcase was this wonderful labor force that they have, and they don't have any labor problems. Everything is great. And so they treated this little community as sort of a showcase for, how great labor conditions are in North Carolina. You should come here. Now, your other point about the Ku Klux Klan is another aspect of this that is very troubling. And because this was my master's thesis, and I wasn't able to do a fully blown study on this. This is, I basically looked at the textile workers and their aspect of it. But what I saw was that the Klan did operate, and not not overtly against African Americans, and there isn't a large Black population nearby, but it was another way for these people to feel good about themselves. That, that's for poor whites throughout the South. I mean, well, and not only in the South. I mean, that was a way to feel somehow that they were more elevated by, by having these racist attitudes. So, yeah, I can't. Did that answer your questions?
Yeah, for the most part. I'm wondering, did the Klan have restrictions or punishments for women who, for example, got pregnant out of wedlock or
yes,
things like that? So the Klan was, in a sense, oppressing not just blacks but women as well. And I don't know if I missed your answer, but were these black domestics women, were they actually getting any money for their
yes,
work?
yes, they got paid, but they got paid, very small wages. But yes, they were the Klan was oppressing women. Actually, not entirely, because the Klan functioned as sort of the culture police of the community. And anybody who was what they described to me as doing wrong, the Klan would send them a letter, and that included domestic abuse, which was a big thing. Drinking in town. I don't remember what the other things were, but actually it made women's lives somewhat better for some. But if you got, the company, if a girl got pregnant, well, she was kicked out of town, as was her family. But the man who got her pregnant didn't have any consequences. So, yeah, well.
Let me use this to open the larger door about the roles that race played in structuring and regulating and limiting solidarity, and the ways. I mean, this point about even as poor as poorly paid and as poor as these mill workers were, that the structure of institutionalized racism enabled them to employ African American women as domestics at a not just low pay, but to experience being over somebody else. And I wonder, I thought that the film was amazing in terms of the number of African American interviews that we see in the film, and that I don't know where George Stoney and Judith Helfand found them. That we know that their research process took them beyond North Carolina to other communities, finding people who might have moved away. But I wondered about, were African Americans at all in the strike of 34? What was their relationship to what was going on? And I don't know who among us might have answers or other speculation to add to that.
I don't know about 34, but I do know that they did get, they were organized after Cooley organized in 1937. They started out with a sub-local, a segregated local. And then, oh gosh, I want to say, I can't remember what year it was, but it's in my article that they did integrate the local. But of course, the irony is there that once, when I spoke to the TWA rep who had been in Cooley, he said, well, once they integrated the local, then, you know, the African Americans sat in the back of the room and they didn't talk. So,
Suzanne, looks like you have something to say.
No, no. I I was just thinking of the interview that George did with the gentleman who, when George asked him, why do you think you weren't allowed to work in the mill? And he said to George, I don't know. Why do you think?
Yeah, right.
You
Yeah.
know?
right.
And you know, even at that point, there was a concern about whether, as a black man, he could admit that it was racism to a white man. You know, this was 25 years ago, but it's
yeah.
I thought that was a stunning moment.
Yes, I mean, I think there are interesting dimensions of this kind of symbiosis of rural life and mill life, and as much as the mill workers may have been able to supplement what their families needed by having access to gardens and farm animals, but likewise the people living on the farm had some access to the cash wages that might be earned in the mills. And there's sort of a kind of a dreadful functionalism in this relationship of the urban and the rural, and allowing the persistence of a lifestyle that's generating profit for somebody else. The mill owners are getting wealthy, while the workers are, at least the white workers, are at this steady state. And it's not clear really where the African American workers, who in many of these communities, and I think someone in the film says, well, the mill work was saved for white people, you know, that African Americans couldn't even get into the mills.
Right, they could only work as janitors or work in the mill yard.
Yeah.
The hardest physical labor was the only thing that was available to them.
Yeah, yeah. Other questions? I certainly have plenty, but I don't want to hog the dynamics. Other questions? Well, then I'm going to, oh, good. Go ahead, Rachel Green, please.
So this is a question directed to Mary. I was really struck by the how you talked about community having this very strong kind of sense of community, and maybe a lack of perspective about these larger systems that were impacting them. And I'm wondering, and then you talked about how the mill closed in 1969, and I'm assuming that's because that's when a lot of mills were closing and moving overseas. And I wonder if the workers had any sense of that, and if so, what their feelings were about that larger thing that was happening and impacting them.
You know, I think they really didn't. I think it came as a huge shock, and what they attributed it to was that Irwin Mills, a couple years earlier, had been sold to Burlington. So they always had an outsider to blame for things rather than Irwin Mills itself. And so the reason, you know, I mentioned earlier that they stayed, they didn't leave. Part of the reason they stayed was in the 1950s, Irwin Mills was trying to relieve itself of some of the responsibilities of sort of taking care of the workers. And so they offered the houses, which were owned by the company, they offered the houses to the workers on very good terms. And so these workers had bought their houses. Now this is the only thing they had, were these houses in this town that now has no economic basis whatsoever. But fortunately, there were other kinds of industrial operations that were within driving distance. And so they were able to get other jobs. So they didn't really, I never heard anybody talk about kind of the larger mobility of capital or I mean, that they didn't experience their lives that way.
So we are fortunate this evening that our friend Dania Rajendra is with us, and Dania is the executive director of the Athena for All project in New York, which is working with Amazon workers around the world. And so I don't want to let Dania get away without telling us a bit about what is going on in Alabama right now and how that might be connected to this history. Dania?
Thanks, Peter. So first, I should say that the Athena, the effort, the community labor effort that I run is like 100,000% in solidarity with the workers in Bessemer, and that is not our campaign, and I do not speak for the campaign. But I'm very proud to have been obviously following it closely, and proud that the woodworkers in Minnesota are founding members of our campaign. And I wanted to draw some parallels, if it's of interest, between what's happening in the organizing in Amazon facilities, both in Alabama, which revisiting this history felt so important in this moment. It's such a seismic moment, I think, for labor history to have this fight, and what the kind of groundwork that their siblings in Minnesota laid in their first walkout several years ago. And then I also have questions, Mary, about the kind of like autonomy of local management that seems sort of evident in your piece, and kind of in reflecting on how different Amazon is now. So a couple of things that I think are important to know. First, it's sort of underappreciated in the reporting that most of the people who work in this Amazon facility in Alabama are Black, and called the union sort of in the moments of the uprisings in response to the murder of George Floyd. And so we really see this interplay of community and workplace activism in almost, I was thinking, Mary, in reading your article, kind of like in an inverse way, I think. And it's very exciting to me as a person who's been working in economic and racial justice for 2 decades that that we can kind of see those things come together. And that this group of people in Alabama really saw that the way that they could make the most change, both in their own lives and in the way in which we understand this humongous corporation, is by taking this collective action together. So I find that super exciting. And similarly, I think it's been so important that the first group of workers to take public action in the United States against Amazon, which is the second largest private sector employer in the United States and rapidly becoming, if you count all of their subcontracted connections, et cetera, they're rapidly becoming the largest private sector employer in the United States, and hold a virtual monopsony, like a total monopoly of the low-wage labor market in many places. So that it was Black Muslim people in Minnesota who took action in relation to both their rights as workers and their rights as Muslims, that their actions were about their rights to observe their religion and the need of the workplace to accommodate that. And I think in the fundamentally authoritarian relationship that most American bosses have with the people who work for them, which I think also kind of pervades in many ways, I think both your article, Mary, and also the film, is how much courage and solidarity we need to even mount a fight, whether it's successful or there are a lot of lessons, I think, about that deep silence around the strike. For all of us, that it really is kind of holding on to one another in that will get us through. And that's much of the ethos at Athena, where we're really trying to figure out how do we build the kinds of relationships where people are in a position to bargain, not beg, with the bigger forces that really so fundamentally control our politics and the possibilities for local governance, and so often our lives. And I have to close by saying hi to Howard. Hi, Howard.
The Wonders of Zoom. And anyone want to?
I could bring it
Oh,
back.
Mike Hazard, please.
I could bring it back to the film for a moment.
Yeah.
I really love this film and had not watched it in a good 10 years. But it struck me when I first watched it, and again, how much like a textile it is in its own construction. And thinking tonight with everyone about solidarity and organizing, that again, like the film, like this Zoom perhaps, there's a kind of solidarity developed in these conversations that is very much like a textile as a metaphor. But I had a specific question. I don't know, Suzanne, were you involved in the use of the film at all with community groups as they worked up towards the broadcast?
Yes, well, they started in the South at Honeypath. That was the first big screening. And the film was brought around to every town. And it was, the response, of course, was amazing, very emotional and very powerful. And it was a way of actually sharing and revealing the history to the townspeople who had no idea that this even went on there, you know. And so it had a very powerful effect.
One of the things that I noticed in some of Judith's writing about, Judith Helfand's writing about it, is that apparently one of the ways it was used is they would show it, but when there was any like strong response, like laughter or tears or you know, some kind of physical response to the film as it was playing, that they would stop.
Yeah.
And this is so weird to me as a filmmaker that you would stop your film because as I know, you know, Suzanne, for George, it wasn't the film, it was the conversation,
yeah.
What happened after the lights came up. But I remained stunned by just reading that was one of the ways that this film was used.
Well, I would like to encourage that use with all films. And what I've started to do is to think of the films I'm making as phrases, you know, so that they can be open to conversation. So I'm making a whole series of 10-minute films that allow for immediate engagement. And I think that's such a good use of film now, because film gives you a real experience with something that you might never have an opportunity to tap into. And to allow for conversation, I think, is essential. Because, yeah, so but that was, you know, George was always so way ahead of his time in terms of using film to really engage a community and to make change, which is why his first big initiative was called Challenge for Change. You know, that was is the big thrust of his work going way back. So I know, you know, as the creator of the structure of the film and the flow that I gave it didn't horrify me that it was stopped at all. and it was created as a weaving. I always weave, you know, film editing is weaving. So thank you for that observation.
It's a beautiful piece, Suzanne.
Oh,
it sure is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I can't speak to the actual experience of being in the South, and you know, that frustrates me too, but I did spend hundreds and hundreds of hours looking at the interviews, the full interviews, so it was as if I were there witnessing it.
Well, and you pointed out just one detail today, that you looked at, who knows, maybe you even looked at all 400 hours of that first mass of material and noticed that there were tables in the way between the audience and, or the viewer and the person speaking. And you sent George back on the road to get that closer relationship. And that is certainly what's going on in this film.
Yeah.
George is sitting with people. There isn't a wall between them. They are together, and that is part of the intimacy of this, and the real sense of authenticity that this film has.
Well, and it's such an important saving of the history, as these people are all gone, and it was so hidden. Now I wanted to say forgotten, but not really forgotten. And thanks to this film has just done a great service for history.
So we're almost out of time, and I want to just end by asking Suzanne to tell us a little bit about the project that she's working on now with Harry Belafonte.
Oh. Well, I'm working on 2 new projects with Harry. When I made the film Sing Your Song, Harry and I developed a very close friendship, and he invited me to share an office with him, and which gave me great access to his life. And I started filming him again with the death of Trayvon Martin, and I was calling the film, or I'm calling the film, Following Harry. And so I've been following him since 2012. He also lives 2 blocks away from my apartment, so we've had many breakfasts together where I've done some of my best filming. And it's following him, and also what follows him when he's not here, because he has such a radical way of thinking, and is so open about his take on history and on the future. And so I've been documenting him, and those are the little films that I've been making, these little phrases. And I'm also making another film about him called Disrupting Injustice, a Belafonte remix, where I'm taking songs that he's either written or used through the early parts of the civil rights movement, and into apartheid, through apartheid. And I'm having him tell the stories of why he sang these songs and what was happening in around these songs. And then I'm bringing in other artists to do a remix to deal with contemporary times. So one song is Those Three Are on My Mind, and it's about Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman. And Pete Seeger wrote the song for Harry. And so he tells the story of Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman, which remarkably, to me, many people, especially young people, have never heard it, have no idea. And then Common is doing a remix of it, and also a young high school kid who wrote these amazing lyrics to it, where he's talking about, those three are on my mind, He grabs his head and sings about Mike Brown and going all the way up to George Floyd. And so it's a way of sharing history, learning from the past, trying to make change, and bringing young people into it through music. So those are the 2 Harry projects.
Well, we certainly look forward to seeing both of them, and to hopefully having conversation with you again, Suzanne, on those occasions.
Well, I want to say how much I appreciated being invited in, not only to share the film, which I think is an important film that should be seen again. Now, I think it has great relevance for today, but I learned so much, and I miss academia. I was studying to be an anthropologist, as I said, with Margaret Mead, and that level of conversation I miss that. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm so proud.
And thank Mary
for
that wonderful article.
I'm proud that we can have these conversations outside of academia.
Yeah.
Academia does not have a lock on the production of knowledge and the sharing
exactly.
of knowledge and experience. And we can even do it on Zoom, God damn it.
But will you continue? I wonder, because we've gotten so used to Zoom, but once the gates are open, I wonder if this whole Zoom camaraderie will continue.
I'm trying to think about how we can do a mix. and have people in the library in real time, but also a screen where we have people being projected who are in Maryland like Ben Sorensen, or New York like you, or New York, Brooklyn like Danya, and we can all be part of a conversation, and we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
I may not figure it out personally, but people I know will figure it out, and it's too good not to, and
Yeah, well,
too
it's
important not to.
It's brought the world together.
Yeah, yeah, it has. Yesterday morning, I watched who I think is one of the most brilliant people in the world, Mahmoud Mamdani, giving a talk in Cape Town, South Africa. 4 o'clock there, 9 o'clock here. People all over the world were listening to Brother Mamdani and the panel of people who had been assembled. And that's some pretty great stuff that we're able to do things like that.
Yeah.
And we're learning. And I think we were great tonight in terms of listening to each other and not stepping on each other, and it can be done. So Mary, thank you so much for sharing your work and your time. And Suzanne, thank you. And thank you everyone who came. Again, if you're not already on the mailing list for Eastside Freedom Library, please get on it. Light a candle tonight for the workers in Bessemer, Alabama.
Yeah.
We're getting close to the tally. And Amazon is certainly throwing their muscle around. This is so important. It's great to see you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Stay well. Thank you.
Dan, thank you.
Hi, Danya.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Mike.